Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another show on History Valley Podcast. And I'm live with Professor Bart Ehrman, and the topic is based upon his book titled Jesus Before the Gospels: How the Earliest Christians Remembered, Changed, and Invented Their Stories of the Savior. So welcome back to History Valley Podcast, Bart Ehrman.
Well, thanks for having me again.
Of course, thank you for coming on. So can you tell us about what kind of information that we have about Jesus prior to the composition of the Gospels?
Yeah, well, we don't have any that comes to us independently. We only have information, that we get from the New Testament. Basically, we have a few things from the Apostle Paul, of course. My book is about how the traditions found in the Gospels got there. The assumption of the book and the assumption of scholarship generally is that the gospel writers weren't just sitting down and making stuff up, that they'd heard stories. And so my question in the book is, how do stories circulate by word of mouth? If the gospel writers are writing, 40, 50, 60 years after Jesus, what do we know about what do we know about how eyewitnesses tell their accounts and whether they're accurate? How do we know about how people tell stories, especially in oral cultures? And how do writers, receive and then themselves retell the stories? And how do we, so what do we know about what's going on with the stories about Jesus before they're being written down for us in the Gospels?
And how many traditions are we talking about here? Is this related to the Q, M, and L sources? And where does Paul get his information about Jesus from?
So, what I argue in the book is not real, shouldn't really be controversial about all of this, because I mean, the basic facts seem to be accepted by just about everyone, that in early Christianity, the followers of Jesus did not immediately write down things that he said and did. Um, One of the views I develop in the book that some people may disagree with, but I don't know why, is that Jesus' followers wouldn't be able to write things down, and there's no record that they did. But that means that the stories had to be circulated, and so the people who knew Jesus during his lifetime, principally his disciples, after his death, came to believe he got raised from the dead and believed that he was the savior of the world, and so they told stories about the stuff he had said and done during his life. And the disciples told people these stories and to try to convert them to believe in Jesus. And those people told other people stories, and those people told other people stories. And Christianity spreads throughout the Roman world by people telling people about the life and teachings and death and resurrection of Jesus. Paul has heard some of those stories. Paul's almost certainly writing before any of our current gospels, and probably before there were any gospels at all. He's writing in the 50s. And so Paul would have been writing most of his letters maybe 25 or 30 years after Jesus' death, and he doesn't tell us much, but he tells us some things. There were written documents, though, that started to circulate, probably before Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You mentioned, for example, the Q source. It's usually thought that Matthew and Luke's Gospels were dependent on Mark's, that Mark was the first to write a full gospel, probably, possibly, but Matthew and Luke both copied large sections of Mark. But Matthew and Luke also have a lot of sayings of Jesus not found in Mark, and they're the same sayings, sometimes word for word the same. And so the assumption is that they got them from another source that scholars call Q. And so there are probably some written sources, but all of these written sources go back to oral traditions that go back, sometime to somebody either making them up or recounting things that Jesus said and did.
Do the Gospels know Paul's letters, or are they deriving their information independently of Paul?
Well, it's a good question, and it's much debated. Um, when I was in graduate school back in the 70s and 80s, the consensus basically was that the gospel writers did not know Paul. And earlier than that, people all thought the gospel writers did know Paul. And now today, some people are arguing again that the gospel writers know Paul. And so it's a pendulum among scholars that swings back and forth, because you could argue either way. one thing you can say for certain, I think, is that the gospel writers did not get their stories about Jesus from Paul, because Paul tells hardly any stories about Jesus. Um, Paul never says anything about any of Jesus' miracles, for example, at all, or about his controversies with scribes and Pharisees, or he doesn't, say anything about the Sermon on the Mount, or most of the sayings of Jesus. He only quotes Jesus twice, and so they didn't get their stuff from him. So they may have known him, and the issue is whether, for example, the Gospel of Mark seems to have a theology of Jesus' death and resurrection that's very similar to Paul's in ways. And so did he get this from Paul? Did he get it from a Pauline community? Did he get it from, people who just kind of saying the same things Paul was saying? That's one thing. The Gospel of Matthew seems to be arguing against views that Paul had. Matthew insists that the followers of Jesus need to keep the law of Moses. And Paul insistently states that keeping the law of Moses has no bearing on salvation. And so they seem to be at odds. And is Matthew reacting to Paul, or is he reacting to somebody else who has views like Paul? We don't know. So the answer is, the short answer, Jacob, is we don't know. And different people have different views. My view is that Paul did not know any of the Gospels. And I don't think that any of the Gospel writers knew any of the letters of Paul that we happen to have today. Whether they knew other things is hard to say.
Can you tell us about the position of the form critics?
Whoa, form critics, yeah. So that's not a subject I get asked about a lot. And so to explain form critics, I need to set out a little bit of background in the history of scholarship on the Gospels, and then I need to explain what the term form critic means. When scholars at the Enlightenment, starting in the 18th century, started realizing that the Gospels have differences among them and contradictions between them, and they tried to figure out how that works. And in the 19th century especially, they started realizing that it sure looks like somebody copied somebody. You get over 90% of Mark's gospel is replicated in Matthew's gospel, and sometimes it's word for word the same. And you just can't get word for word, sayings of Jesus or word for word accounts of things he did unless somebody's copying somebody. And so the question was, who was copying whom? And in the 19th century, what developed especially was the idea that Matthew and Luke used Mark, and that they both had this Q source. And Matthew had his own sources that scholars called M for Matthew's special sources, and Luke had his own special stuff called L for Luke's special source. And then you got John, which is a whole different thing. And scholars are really interested in the 19th century about what sources there are, written sources behind the Gospels. In the early 20th century, some scholars thought that that had been pretty well decided well enough. We have about as good of an idea as we're going to have about what written sources are behind the Gospels. But these Gospels these stories didn't start out as written accounts. They started out as oral accounts. And scholars in the 1920s especially, in Germany, Martin Debelius and Rudolf Bultmann in particular, also a guy named Carl Schmidt, started realizing that the stories we have in our Gospels are often virtually the same story with different specifics put into them. Like you have all these healing stories, for example, and the plot is almost always the same. Somebody is very, very sick, or is hurt in some ways, is sick, and either that person or a relative comes up to Jesus and asks for healing. Jesus goes to the person and heals the person. The crowds have gathered around, and Jesus heals the person by saying a word or by touching the person, and then the crowds all marvel. It's like boom, boom, boom. It's this happens, then this, then this, then this, then this. It's the same sequence just about every time. You just change what the sickness is and who the person is, and so they started realizing that these particular kinds of stories have a form to them. They like their stories, like you've got the form and you just fill in the details to make a different story, but it's the same form. Form critics were interested in analyzing how in the telling and retelling of stories about Jesus, certain forms of story emerged. And you can analyze a story according to its formal characteristics, its formal literary characteristics. And when you do that, you can come to some kinds of conclusions about what kinds of stories, what forms of stories would have been told in what historical contexts. And so what form criticism did is it analyzed the gospel stories about Jesus, both his sayings and his activities, and decided, what are the formal characteristics of this kind of story, that kind of story, and in what context of the early church would such stories have been told. That they called that the Sitzimleben. They were German scholars. Sitzimleben is the term for the situation in life. And so if you've got a community that, for example, is telling stories about how Jesus has a confrontation with Pharisees about keeping the Sabbath, and the Pharisees object to Jesus' doings on the Sabbath, and Jesus objects to the Pharisaic view, and the story ends with Jesus delivering a withering one-liner to which they have no reply. Okay, so you ask, well, what within the history of Christian church would lead people to tell that particular kind of story about Jesus? And you come up, it's kind of speculative, but you think, well, maybe it's because the storytellers telling the story themselves are being confronted by non-Christian Jews who are objecting to us not keeping the Sabbath. And we're showing that, in fact, our master, our Lord Jesus, also had a different view of Sabbath than these people have. And his one-liner settles it. This is why it's okay to do what we do on the Sabbath. And so you try to figure out what's going on in the situation in the church that leads to these stories to be devised the way they are. And that was called then form criticism.
How did the followers of Jesus view him prior to the composition of the Gospels?
Right. Well, once again, we have real difficulty explaining things like this because we don't have very many sources of information. The Gospels are usually dated to Mark is usually thought to be the first Gospel written around the year 70. Matthew and Luke maybe in the 80s, 80 or 85. John, the last Gospel, maybe 90 to 95. These are guesstimates, but there are reasons for thinking they're pretty close. So if Jesus died in the year 30, our first account of his life would be 40 years later or so. And so the question is, well, what were Christians believing before that? Our only source of information that we're sure was prior to the Gospels are the writings of Paul. Paul has 13 letters in the New Testament. That there are 13 letters that claim to be written by Paul. Scholars doubt whether he wrote 6 of those, but the other 7 they call the undisputed Pauline letters, or the undisputed Pauline epistles. And they're disputed, of course. Everything's disputed in scholarship, but these are the ones that virtually everybody agrees. So those give us some information. You certainly learn what Paul believed about Jesus and what he wanted his communities to believe about him. And you also get hints about what people who disagree with Paul say about Jesus in his letters, because he's opposed to people with different views. So that gives you some information. The Gospels themselves give you some information. What scholars do is they go through every imaginable source in the New Testament, outside the New Testament, anything imaginable that could provide information, and they analyze it to death until they come up with a reconstruction. It's usually thought that at least as soon as Jesus' followers thought he got raised from the dead, they, at least by then, they thought that he was a divine being who had been taken up to heaven, that he's the Lord of the world, and that his death was the death that brought about a sacrifice for sins, so that a person is made right with God by this perfect sacrifice of Jesus, and that Jesus had certain, rules about how you ought to live, and that you ought to follow those rules. And so there, there's a whole bunch of things we could say about what they believed, but basically they believed the what they considered the essential message about Jesus' death and resurrection, and as a result, the miraculous life that he led.
I'm going to take this super chat question real quick. Brett Forsyth, thank you for your super chat. What is your idea of baptism by fire? Possibly olive oil, Jesus baptizing by fire, not water. John's baptism is by water. Possible reference to Enochian fire baptism into an angel?
It's very difficult to say. Baptism by fire. And it's, in some ways it is a contrast to what's going on with John the Baptist. The imagery is quite ancient, of the contrast between water and fire, going back to the idea that at one point God destroyed the world by water, and the next time he'll destroy it by fire. The idea that the world will be destroyed by fire is not restricted to the Christian tradition. Stoics, for example, believe that the world would be destroyed by fire. What does it mean to be baptized by fire? It's hard to say. Being baptized by water in the early Christianity indicated that a person had been cleansed of their sins and had been restored to a right relationship with God. And in a sense, that was understood to be the beginning of a new transformation of the world, that the world now is being transformed into a divine paradise that God had planned. Now that we have these people who are following Jesus, who are doing the things that he told them to do, they're things that Jesus insists that people do will be things that will be done in the coming kingdom of God. In the kingdom of God that Jesus expects, there'll be no, there won't be any poverty, and so people are supposed to relieve poverty now. There won't be any evil forces, and so people are supposed to cast out demons now. There won't be any illness, so people should tend to the sick now. There won't be any war, so people should be peacemakers now. The followers of Jesus start implementing the ideals of the kingdom in the present, and it's those who are baptized in water who do that, who are baptized in the name of Jesus. Baptism by fire appears to refer to being dunked in fire, and that appears to be a reference to the apocalyptic event that's going to bring to an end this age and bring in the kingdom. At the end of this age, God himself is going to intervene, and it's not that there'll be a kind of a small community of people who are now living the life of the kingdom, the followers of Jesus. It's going to be that the kingdom takes over the world. For that to happen, the world has to be cleansed. Both water and fire are cleansing agents. Water is a little less extreme when it comes to human beings than fire, but at the end, God will cleanse the world completely with fire, and that will then bring in the new age where there'll only be good things here on earth, and God will rule supreme. And so being baptized by fire means you're going to go through this apocalypse to enter into the kingdom.
Who are the real authors of the Gospels?
Right. So this is a long one. I actually have one of my talks online. I've got a recorded course. I think it's just one lecture maybe, but it's a free course on did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually write Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? And these four Gospels have been attributed to those four persons since the end of the 2nd century. The first clear attribution to people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John comes in the writings of Irenaeus around the year 185 of the Common Era, so about 100 years after the books had been in circulation. The four authors that are given these attributions, two of them, Matthew and John, are said to be disciples of Jesus, and so they are Aramaic speaking Jews from the Galilee area. Two of them, Mark and Luke, are said to be companions of the apostles. Mark is also from Israel, an Aramaic speaking Jew from Israel, who in the tradition comes from Jerusalem. He's the companion of Peter in the tradition, and Luke is a companion of Paul. Luke is not necessarily a Jew, it's not clear if he's supposed to be thought of as a Jew or not. So those are the four authors that these books are assigned to, but the assignments weren't made for 100 years, so far as we know. And so the question is, who really wrote these things? We don't know the names of the people who wrote them. There are very good reasons for thinking they were not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. For one thing, three of these are Aramaic-speaking Jews from Israel, and these books are written in high-level Greek. They're written by people who have a very high education in Greek language and literature. I need to stress this point a little bit because most people living in Israel did not get a Greek education, even if they could speak a little bit of Greek. That doesn't make you capable of writing books like this. So in the ancient educational system, for one thing, only the rich kids, the very elite children of elite families, could afford the time and the money to get any schooling at all. There wasn't anything like universal education. Most people could not read or write. Well over 90% in Israel at the time could not read at all, let alone sign their name. And in the ancient curriculum, when people did learn to read and write, they learned to read first, and that took years. After they learned to read, they learned how to write. And learning to write meant, learning how to copy letters and things. Learning to compose took another set of years. And so you got to be really highly educated to be able to write. And to write in a foreign language, Greek, that takes more years. And so whoever's writing these things is really well educated by ancient standards in Greek. They appear to be Greek-speaking followers of Jesus, not living in Israel. And there's nothing to indicate they are in Israel, and there are lots of things to indicate they're not. One thing is their fluency in literary Greek. Another thing is sometimes their occasional lapse of knowledge about either Judaism or Israel, the nation, the geography of it, or both. The short answer, we don't know. There are people living decades later, living in a different part of the world, who spoke Greek and have become Christian. Another big question is how many of them were Jews? Many people assume that all four of them were Jews, but I don't think so. I think Luke was certainly not a Jew. I don't think Mark was a Jew. I've got reasons for thinking that. Within Mark itself, Mark explains things in ways that aren't really true to Judaism in chapter 7. And so it looks like he's probably not a Jew either. John and Matthew people debate about.
I'm going to take the super chat real quick. Michael E., thank you for your super chat. Dr. Tabor and YouTube seems convinced the Talpiot tomb is the authentic tomb of Jesus of Nazareth. What do you think and why?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, I know that James Tabor does think that, and he's talked and written a good deal about that. I don't think that the evidence of it is very good. I think that there are lots of ways to explain these inscriptions in the tomb. I am impressed that every archaeologist I know, except for James himself, digs in does archaeological digs right now in Jerusalem, I think. But the professional archaeologists I know, none of them is convinced by this, and so I don't think that it's a strong. There's a strong argument for it. It'd be great if it was. I mean, I'd have no principled objections, but that would be amazing, wouldn't it? And I certainly wouldn't accept it because in some way it would debunk Christianity. So I don't have an agenda either way. I think it would be really, really historically interesting if it was. And so I'm not disinclined to think so, but I just don't think there's really any good reason to think it is.
What does Papias tell us?
Well, Papias tells us several things. Papias is he's a church father who was living in the early 2nd century. He wrote a 5-volume book that we no longer have that's called The Exposition of the Sayings of the Lord. We don't even know what the book really was. There are lots of opinions about that. On the surface of it, the title, Exposition of the Sayings of the Lord, makes it sound like it's some kind of commentary on the things that Jesus said. And so a kind of explanation of Jesus' teachings. This is a 5-volume book. Boy, if this is what it was, we sure wish we had it. Other people have different ideas about what it was. I mean, some people have argued, for example, that it's a list, it's a discussion of biblical prophecies of Jesus. Some people say that it's actually a discussion of both Jesus' sayings and his deeds. And so that it's actually a kind of an exposition of the surviving Gospels. I don't think those explanations are very convincing. I know that there are evangelical Christians who want to insist that Papias is talking about Gospels, and probably our Gospels, containing the words and deeds of Jesus. But the title of his work is an exposition of the Logia of the Lord. Logia means words. It does not mean narratives of actions. And so it appears to be a book connected some way with Jesus' words. We don't have the book, his 5-volume book, anymore. We don't know exactly why it wasn't copied, but the kind of ruling assumption is because most early Christians didn't like it very well. we have good reason for thinking they didn't like it very well, because the later church fathers who mention Papias sometimes don't really appreciate his work. Eusebius, the church father Eusebius, who mentions him and his work, says that Eusebius literally calls Papias a man of very small intelligence. You don't want people saying that about you if you're an author. So they didn't preserve the book. What we have of the book are occasional quotations from the book by Eusebius, going back as early as Irenaeus. Eusebius is living in the early 4th century. Irenaeus is living at the end of the 2nd century. They both quote Papias in a couple of places, as do some later sources. And so we have quotations of Papias that are preserved in later writers, and these quotations deal with a variety of topics connected largely with Jesus and his life. One of the more famous of the passages is one in which Papias says that Mark wrote his gospel as the interpreter or translator of Peter, and that the Gospel of Mark is Peter's version of the story as Peter told it, and then it came to be narrated to Mark, his secretary, and that Mark wrote it down. Another quotation says that Matthew wrote his gospel. It says Matthew wrote the words of Jesus in the Hebrew language, and everyone translated them as best he could, or either translated or interpreted them as best they could. The word, it could be translated either way. And so those two sayings are important for the topic of Jesus before the Gospels, because many people traditionally have taken Papias to say that our Gospel of Mark gives you Peter's version direct from Peter, and that Matthew's Gospel is written by an eyewitness, Matthew the tax collector. And so that's based on Papias. So in my book on Jesus before the Gospels, I have to have a long discussion of that issue. Does Papias actually provide us evidence that Mark wrote a gospel and that it's Peter's version, and that Matthew wrote a gospel and that Matthew was actually an eyewitness, the tax collector, who wrote his gospel in Hebrew? What I argue in my book is that if you actually look at what Papias says closely, it doesn't appear that he really provides evidence that talking about our Matthew and Mark. It's clearest with Matthew. When Papias says that Matthew wrote a gospel in the Hebrew language, that he wrote the sayings of Jesus in the Hebrew language, well, neither thing is an explanation of our Gospel of Matthew. Our Gospel of Matthew is not a collection of the sayings of Jesus. I mean, of course it has sayings of Jesus. Every gospel is sayings of Jesus, but it doesn't have it's not the sayings of Jesus, like like the Gospel of Thomas, for example, is the sayings of Jesus, or the Q source appears to be largely sayings of Jesus. Matthew's not that, and our Matthew is not written in Hebrew. Our Matthew is written in Greek, and one way for knowing that our Matthew was written in Greek is because it has word for word agreements with his own source, Mark, which was written in Greek. And so the only way to get word for word agreements with another Greek document is to write in Greek. So Matthew, our Gospel of Matthew is written in Greek. It's not a collection of the sayings of Jesus. And so what's Papias talking about? I don't know. He either knows of a gospel that's in Hebrew, that is, a list of Jesus' sayings, or he's heard of a gospel like that, or he's heard of a gospel and he assumes that Matthew wrote it, or or something else. I don't know what he's doing, but he's not talking. Doesn't seem to be talking about our Matthew. And if he's not talking about our Matthew, I don't see any reason to think he's talking about our Mark, especially because this is my final point about this. Especially because especially the evangelical or the conservative Christian biblical scholars who say that Papias is hard evidence that Matthew and Mark were written, by a disciple and by a companion of Peter. They take Papias at his word about that. But when you look at the other things that Papias says in the quotations that are preserved of him, these same modern scholars say, oh God, well, that ain't right. What he describes is not what happened. They say that about the other things Papias says, but they don't say it about this thing. Why? Because this is the thing they agree with. The other things they disagree with. So Papias, didn't know what he's talking about for the other things, but this thing, okay, that's evidence. So I think if you actually look at Papias's writings, it's pretty clear that he is recounting legends that he's heard, that he exaggerates a lot of things. He says things that are historically not right, and that it's really not evidence that Matthew and Mark are the authors of our Gospels.
Michael E., thank you for your super chat. Could the New Testament support the growth of a more environmentally centered Christianity today, or is it anthropocentric to the core?
What I would say is that the entire Bible, New Testament and Old Testament, are as the Christian scriptures, don't have many of our concerns. They weren't concerned of us, burning up our planet or blowing us off our planet. They apparently, so far as we can tell, were not concerned about many of the social issues that we were concerned about, because it was a very different time then. And if you're living the New Testament, the Roman Empire that we think of as this enormous place is, in terms of population, the Roman Empire is about 60 million people. Well, that's not, by modern standards, that's not that huge. And so what about environmental concerns? What I would say is that in some ways, passages related to the creation of the world are the best passages that Christians would go to talk about environmental issues. And especially, for example, Christians affirm Genesis 1, that God created the heavens and the earth, and then he gave the dominion of the heavens and the earth to humans. And many Christians have taken that to mean, well, we're the lords of this planet. We can do anything with it we want. It's our place. But, actually God gave the planet to humans so they take care of it. Adam is supposed to tend the garden. He's not to deforest it. He's not supposed to chop down the trees. And so that's where I think Christians who are interested in environmental issues would go. And it's a little bit harder with the New Testament because there's not a lot that is focused on that, except for the book of Revelation, which talks about the destruction of this planet. And it's going to be destroyed by God because it's become a sinful place. And God will recreate it. He's going to recreate it into a paradise. The ultimate point of the book of Revelation and of Jesus' teachings and of Paul is that this world is going to become a paradise. Well, if you want to implement the concerns of Jesus, Paul, and the book of Revelation, you should try to make this world a paradise. You shouldn't like deforest it or ruin it with fossil fuels or melt the ice caps or whatever else you're doing to it. Shouldn't do that. So you can use the New Testament for that kind of thing, but I'd say it's more indirectly rather than pointing to a verse that says, thou shalt not pollute.
And what else are we told about the Gospels toward the end of the 2nd century CE?
So the Gospels are written, toward the end of the 1st century. They appear to begin being quoted pretty quickly after that. There appear to be quotations of possibly Matthew and Luke in the early 2nd century, possibly in the Didache, in Ignatius may know Matthew, maybe more. The author Polycarp knows multiple sources. The Justin Martyr, living in the 150, writing around 150 in Rome, quotes the Gospels. He doesn't name them. He calls them the memoirs of the apostles, but he doesn't explain what that means exactly, and he doesn't give them any names. The only gospel he names is the Gospel of Peter, which people have tended to say, oh, he means the Gospel of Mark, but he doesn't say the Gospel of Mark. He says talk about Peter as the author of the Gospel, and we do have a Gospel of Peter that was floating around then. So I think he probably means that Gospel. My point is that up to Irenaeus around 185, people were using the Gospels, and they were using them to show what Jesus really said, more interested in what he said than in what he did, although there's some references to his activities, certainly to his death and resurrection. The Gospels appear to be taken as authorities for that kind of information. Other Christian groups, many Christian groups, had other accounts of Jesus' life that they used as authoritative. But the decision that was made in some circles by the time of Irenaeus, I don't think this is Irenaeus' decision. I think he's reporting that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were the 4 that were to be considered authoritative. The same view appears to be represented in a little fragment of a text that we don't have the full text. We don't know who wrote it, but is around the time of Irenaeus. It was discovered by an Italian scholar called Muratori, and so it's called the Muratorian fragment because it's a fragment that's in Latin, which is pretty bad Latin actually, or pretty horrible Latin, possibly by a scribe who didn't know Latin well enough. But it's a list of the books that this anonymous author thought belonged in the New Testament. The list is fragmentary. It begins in the middle of a description of a gospel, but it doesn't say which gospel it's talking about. But then it says the 3rd book of the Gospels is Luke. And then it gives the 4th gospel, it names it John, and says a few things about Luke and John. So around the time of Irenaeus, if Luke and John are the 3rd and 4th book, that means the Muratorian fragment probably also had Matthew and Mark. And so at this time, the proto-Orthodox Christian communities, by which I mean the communities of Christians that held to the views that eventually emerged as the ones that just about everybody held, those Christian groups were seeing Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as authoritative texts, as the authoritative texts for understanding Jesus, his teachings, his activities, his death, and his resurrection, and that other gospels were not considered to be authoritative. And so we can put together, possibly like what does Irenaeus think about the New Testament, about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because he tells us some things and he quotes it a lot. And, Tertullian, writing around 200, we can get a lot more information out of Tertullian. So by the end of the 2nd century, people are valuing the Gospels as written accounts of Jesus' life, and they're attributing them to the apostles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Why were the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John chosen?
Okay, so I'm going to have to take each one at a time because they weren't chosen. It wasn't like there weren't like options of sets of four, right? Which set of four do you want? It was like each one had its own reason behind it. So um, let me, I think I'll go backwards. John was known to be the last gospel already in the 2nd century. At the end of the 2nd century, people are calling it the last gospel. Why did people pick John, the disciple, to call him the author of the gospel? I'll say off the bat that it's unlikely that John, the son of Zebedee, was the author of this gospel. For one thing, he was a fisherman in Galilee who spoke Aramaic. Fishermen did not get educations, let alone higher educations, let alone like higher educations in Greek, let alone learning how to compose. And I have trouble convincing people of all this because they say, well, look, people, back then they could speak Greek, right? So he could write the book. And I'm thinking, I've got college students who are like some of the smartest students in America at my university. Are some of the smartest people in America at that stage. They are seniors in college who are very smart. They could not write a gospel like the Gospel of John. They can't. They just can't. I don't know a single one who could, of any of my students. I mean, and so we're talking about somebody who's really, really highly educated in Greek. So that being said, why do they choose John? Why do they put that name on it? All right. Well, in this particular, it's an interesting case for John. The case is that there's this figure in the Gospel of John that doesn't appear in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that is called the disciple whom Jesus loved. And so usually goes under the name the beloved disciple. There are two passages in the Gospel of John that people have taken to be self-references of this beloved disciple. In chapter 21, for example, it says that that the disciple who saw these things, well, no, that's chapter 19. The disciple who saw the blood and water come out of Jesus' side has testified about these things, and so and so people say, well, all right, so this is the author's telling you that you can trust what he's having to say. And so you get a passage in chapter 19, chapter 21. Okay, so this person who's the close disciple of Jesus is the author of this gospel. That's the view. I think that's a problematic view, but that's the view. So which disciple would it be? This is somebody who is close to Jesus, not just one of the 12. He's the one leaning on Jesus' breast at the Last Supper. And so he's one of the closest disciples. Well, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the three closest disciples were Peter, James, and John. So probably one of those three. Which of the three is it? It couldn't be Peter. It can't be Peter because in the Gospel of John, the beloved disciple is shown with Peter in some episodes where they're two different people, Peter and John. And sometimes they're kind of in competition with each other. So it can't be Peter. Peter and the beloved disciple. It can't be Peter. It can't be James because everybody knew that the Gospel of John was the last written, and James was the first apostle to be martyred, already recounted in the book of Acts. So James wouldn't have been alive at the time that this book was written. And if it ain't Peter and it ain't James, it's got to be John. And so by process of elimination, people said this is written by John, the son of Zebedee. Okay, so that's John. Okay, so each of these has a different explanation. Luke. The Gospel of Luke has a second volume, the book of Acts. Whoever wrote Luke also wrote the book of Acts. The book of Acts is an account of the spread of Christianity after Jesus' death. The first 30 years after Jesus' death, the main character in the first part of Acts is Peter. The main character in the first maybe fourth or third, the main character in the second 2/3 of Acts is Paul. The author of Acts describes what's happening in the lives of the apostles, especially Peter and Paul. But in 4 places in Acts, the author, who does not tell us who he is, the author starts talking in the first person, not about what Paul and his companions were doing, but about what we were doing. These 4 passages that start in chapter 16 are sometimes called the we passages in Acts, because all of a sudden it looks like the author has joined Paul and the others and is doing things with them. And so from the ancient world, it was thought that whoever wrote Acts was one of Paul's companions. And since the same person wrote Luke, then is the same person. So who was it? It's long been thought that both Luke and Acts have a focus on the importance of the message of Christ to Gentiles. That the book of Acts is largely about how the message of salvation went to the Gentile world, so that people who were not Jews could be followers of Jesus without becoming Jews. That's one of the major points of Acts. And the question then is, well, who would be interested in that? Probably a Gentile. And so it's likely that this is somebody who's a Gentile. And so it's a Gentile companion of Paul. Well, who are the Gentile companions of Paul that we know about? In the book of Colossians, which is attributed to Paul, even though the majority of scholars critical scholars doubt that Paul wrote it. But whether he wrote it or not, in the early church, they thought he wrote it. And in Colossians, the last chapter, chapter 4, Paul mentions some of his co-workers, and he names a couple of them and said, these are the ones from the Jewish people. And then he goes on and names others, which are obviously not Jews, i.e. Gentiles. And he mentions 3 in particular, Demas, Epaphras, and Luke. And so, well, okay, those are 3 Gentile apostles. Companions of Paul the apostle. Could one of them have written it? Well, it almost certainly could not have been Demas, because Demas is later, somewhere else in the New Testament, is said to have abandoned Paul, and Paul was ticked off that Demas had abandoned him, so it's not likely he's going to write a book with Paul as the hero. Epaphras probably didn't write it, because Epaphras appears to be claimed to be the founder of the church in Colossae in the book of Colossians. So he's the one who started the church, the Colossian church. But oddly, among all the churches mentioned in the book of Acts, we don't find the church in Colossae. And so it seems unlikely that the guy who founded that church would overlook that part when talking about Paul's mission. And so that leaves Luke. In Colossians, Luke is called the beloved physician. And so Luke, the doctor, is said, okay, that's the guy. He wrote Acts, and so he wrote the Gospel of Luke. Okay, so that's that account. Next is chronologically is Matthew. Matthew is a little bit trickier because there's not much evidence to suggest why, who wrote it. Unlike, you could mount an argument, at least for Luke and John. What has been long noted, though, is that there's a call of a disciple in Matthew's gospel, the call of Matthew, the tax collector. This disciple is, Matthew, the disciple, is as well called to be a disciple in Mark's gospel. But in Mark's gospel, he's called Levi. So he's called Levi in Mark, but Matthew repeats the story, but he calls him Matthew. Why would that be? Well, the idea is this is somebody who has 2 names, and he prefers his own name, Matthew. And so Matthew gives you an eyewitness account by Jesus' disciple, Matthew, and the evidence is this call of Matthew in chapter 9. Mark? Why Mark? Well, the Gospel of Mark, people thought, this really, boy, Peter sure figures prominently in this gospel. And, but I don't think Peter probably didn't write it. We're not quite sure why people would not attribute it to Peter. One theory that I kind of like, that hardly anybody has, but I kind of like it, is that people in the early church who were assigning names to these gospels knew about a gospel of Peter that was floating around, and they thought it was a heretical text. And maybe they didn't want to call this gospel the Gospel of Peter because it has bad connotations. So they assigned it to somebody who would know what Peter's views were. And you have this thing in Papias about, there being this guy Mark who was Peter's companion. And in the book of 1 Peter, a guy named Mark is named as somebody that Peter knows. And so maybe it's this companion of Peter named Mark. And so it gets attributed to Mark. So at the end of the day, what ends up happening is you have the four Gospels. Two of them are assigned to eyewitnesses, Matthew the tax collector and John, the beloved disciple. And two of them are assigned to companions of apostles, Mark, the companion of Peter, and Luke, the companion of Paul. So you have the testimonies of two eyewitnesses and the testimony of the two main apostles, Peter and Paul, through their companions. So, yeah, I'm sorry, Jacob, that was a long answer, but I go into better detail and some more convincing stuff in the book itself.
Oh, no problem. I thought it was great. Let me pull up this question. Paul Val, thank you for your super chat. Have all your audiobooks, question, your view on Marcion being first, Klinghardt, Kloppenborg, Vincent, IA.
Okay.
Hold on, let me state one more thing. I don't think Kloppenborg thinks that Marcion's gospel is first, just to...
No, I don't think so either. In fact, I'm sure he doesn't. And I don't know if the first thing is, oh, he's saying he has all my audiobooks. Okay, good, great. I'm glad. Looks like possibly you're from the Netherlands, Paul. I'm getting that right. Good. I'm glad you've got my audiobooks. I'm sure that this book is on audio too, someplace or other. So what about Marcion's gospel being first? This is really a very small minority view among scholars. I don't know Klinghardt. I know Vincent a little bit, Marcus Vincent. He was a very, very bright guy. The idea, well, I need to explain it because I don't know how much your listeners will know all the ins and outs of what this question's about. Marcion is a writer who is usually dated to the 2nd century. Middle of the 2nd century. We know about him not from his own writings, because, as was the case with Papias earlier, his own writings don't survive, but they are quoted. In this case, they're quoted not just by people who don't think highly of him, the way Papias was. In this case, Marcion's writings are quoted by his true sworn enemies, people who despise him. Proto-Orthodox heresiologists. A heresiologist is somebody who studies heresy, but it really means it's somebody who talks about heresy in order to attack it. And so, for example, Irenaeus, whom I mentioned in 185, Tertullian, about 15, 20 years later, write about Marcion, as does Epiphanius later. The main sources for Marcion, though, are Tertullian and Epiphanius. Epiphanius is in the 4th century. Tertullian's around 200, early 3rd century, and they both attack Marcion rather viciously. Tertullian has a 5-volume book opposing Marcion that we still have. You can get it in English translation, and he goes after Marcion because he thinks he's an arch heretic. Marcion was a popular teacher. It is somewhat difficult to reconstruct his biography about his life, but there are basic outlines that look pretty clear to most of us. He started out in a city called Sinope, which is on the southern coast of the Black Sea, south central part of the Dead Sea. He was connected with the shipping industry. He made a lot of money. And at one point in his life, and he was a Christian, at one point of his life, he decided to immigrate to Rome because that's where the action was, where as far as Christianity went. And it looks like he spent about 5 years in Rome developing his theological views that involved his writing 2 books or producing 2 books. One of his books was called the Antitheses, that I'll explain in a second. The other of his books was a collection of writings that he claimed were authoritative scripture, a New Testament. So I want to say something about both of those books before addressing the question, because anything I say about direct answer to this question isn't going to make sense unless people have all this background. about which, of course, a lot more could be said. People have written entire books, very good books, on Marcion. The most recent and probably the best is by Judith Liu, Lieu. Her book on Marcion is sort of the modern classic in the field. So Marcion's theology was deeply rooted in his understanding that the Apostle Paul was the apostle who got everything right, and Jesus' own disciples got everything wrong, and that most Christians have gotten everything wrong because they didn't understand Paul. What Marcion maintained is that Paul's distinction between the law and the gospel, the distinction between the law of Moses and the gospel of Jesus, was a vital distinction that Paul meant absolutely. Paul not only said that a person is made right with God by believing in the gospel of Christ, that he died and rose from the dead, he not only insisted that that was true, he insisted that the other view, that the law of Moses had anything to do with it, was wrong. The law of Moses had nothing to do with it. But for Marcion, that split of law and gospel is extreme. The reason that the law of the Jews has nothing to do with the salvation brought by Jesus is because Jesus represents a different God from the God who gave the law. The Jewish God is not the God of Jesus, and Paul saw that. The God of the Old Testament is a God of wrath, an angry God, and a just God who gives a law that nobody can keep. Everybody breaks it, so he sends them all to hell. That's not the God of Jesus. The God of Jesus is the God of love and mercy. The God of Jesus sent Jesus into the world to save people from the God of the Jews. This world was created by the God of the Jews. This other God is called the stranger God, meaning he's a stranger, meaning he's not connected with this world, and neither is Jesus. If Jesus was connected with this world, he'd be connected with the Creator God. And that's the wrong God. That's the violent God of the Old Testament. That means, though, that Jesus is not part of the creation, which means he wasn't really born. Jesus is not a flesh and blood human born into this material world because he has nothing to do with this material world. He's a spiritual being sent from the spiritual God to save people from the materialist God of the Old Testament. Okay? So Marcion's Antitheses, his book, The Antitheses, man, we sure wish we had this one still. We have some idea of the things that were in it. It was called The Antitheses because what it did is it contrasted views of the Jewish Bible with the views of Paul and Jesus. And so, for example, in the Hebrew Bible, the children of Israel are told to take the promised land. They have to conquer the promised land. And in the book of Joshua, they're told to go in and destroy the city of Jericho. And so first conquest on the other side of the Jordan there. And so they're told to go attack Jericho. And God tells them, the God of the Jews, the Old Testament God tells them, tells Joshua and the troops, you're supposed to march around the city once a day. Do that for 6 days. On the 7th day, march around 7 times, and then shout and blow the trumpets, and the walls will come tumbling down. And when they do, go into the city and slaughter every man, woman, child, and animal. And they do it. God orders them to kill in cold blood all of these people and animals. So they do. And Marcion says, okay, that's the God of the Old Testament. What's the God of the New Testament say? The God of the New Testament says, love your enemy. If somebody strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. You're to be peacemakers, and so forth and so on. This ain't the same God. So the Antitheses tried to show that the Old Testament God could not be the God of Jesus, and that Paul was the only one who realized it. And the disciples of Jesus, who were Jewish, they didn't get it either. And so that's why Jesus had to appear Paul much later, because like the others weren't getting it still. And so, all right, so that's the Antitheses. In order to buttress his position, Marcion insisted that he had sacred writings that would support his views. Marcion may be the first person, the first Christian to accumulate a set of writings and declare that they are the authorities for Christians. When Christianity started, now I'm talking historically. When they started, they had a canon of scripture. They had the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. I mean, we call it the Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible was their scripture. They were Jews. They had a Bible. But as people started thinking about the authority of Jesus and the new faith that came about after his death and resurrection, they needed authorities for that. And eventually we got our 27-book canon of the New Testament. Marcion had a canon before the 27-book canon. His may have been the first. It was an 11-book canon. It contained 10 of Paul's letters, the ones we have in the New Testament, minus 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, and he had a form of our Gospel of Luke. The problem with the Gospel of Luke for Marcion, and the problem with the 10 letters of Paul, is that they seem to affirm the Old Testament. They quote it, and they support it, and they seem to think that the God of the Old Testament is the God of Jesus, and Marcion doesn't agree with those things. So, according to the church fathers, Marcion edited his canon, his 10 letters of Paul and the book of Luke. He edited them with a penknife, as Tertullian says. In other words, he cut out the parts that he thought were not originally there. He thought originally Luke was in a different version, and that Paul's letters were in different versions, and that these people who didn't understand Jesus had changed the texts to make them affirm the God of the Old Testament. But so Marcion is trying to return these texts to their original state, and he does that by cutting out the bits that he thinks are later additions. So you might think, for example, the Jefferson Bible, kind of a comparable thing in the modern period, where you don't want the miracles, you want the sayings, and so you cut out all the miracles. Well, he cuts out all the Old Testament stuff. Okay, that is about a 10-minute introduction, a 7-minute introduction to the question. The question is it possible that Marcion's version of Luke, in fact, is not an edition of Luke that has cut out things? Is it possible that it's the first version of Luke that has had things added to it later? Is that possible? Okay, so there are a couple things to be said about this. One is, it's a question of whether you're asking whether Marcion himself created the first version of what we call Luke, or if you're saying that Marcion used what is our first version of Luke. See what I'm saying? I mean, you could be saying Marcion invented this thing and he was writing before, he was writing before we think he was living. So the normal dates for his activities that people give are that he went to Rome in the year 139 and he stayed there till 145, and he spent those years developing his theology, writing his books, and then at the end of it, he tried to convince the church leaders in Rome that his views were right, and they didn't think so, and they kicked him out of the church. Okay, that's so in 145. So that his version would have been written in the 140s. And so if you think that Marcion wrote the original version of Luke before the additions were made, if you think he wrote it, one way to do that is to say that he was writing well before the 140s, and to date him earlier, date him around the year 100. Most scholars who are experts in this stuff find that highly problematic, that he was writing that early. You could say, though, that Marcion didn't invent this form of Luke, that it's simply that the version of Luke he had available to him was this other version that was without these parts in it, and that this was original Luke. Now, that's a different proposition, and in some ways, for me, it's a more interesting proposition. For me, it's interesting in part because I think one aspect of it could be right. I personally, this isn't, I don't want to make it sound like it's just like one day I came to an opinion. I mean, after looking into this stuff really hard for a really long time, I came to the judgment that I don't think originally Luke had chapters 1 and 2. Our Luke 1 and 2 I think, were not originally in Luke's gospel. I have extended reasons for saying this. You can find those reasons in my course. And did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John write Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? But the thing is that Luke chapters 1 and 2 give the birth narrative of Jesus, and the events mentioned in these two chapters never get mentioned anywhere else in all of Luke or in the book of Acts. They're both long books. You put Luke and Acts together, and it's 1/4 of the New Testament. And the later books don't say anything about Jesus being born of a virgin, being born in Bethlehem, if anything like that. That's in Luke, in the chapters 1 and 2. The writing style is different from the rest of Luke. It's a very different writing style. The beginning of Luke, chapter 3, verse 1, sure sounds like the beginning of a gospel. And so I don't think it had 1 and 2, and I don't think Marcion's version of Luke had 1 and 2. He was attacked for taking off chapters 1 and 2 with his penknife. But I suspect that if he had a form of Luke that didn't have 1 and 2, and that there were different forms floating around. That's not to say, though, that I agree with the hypothesis that Marcion's Luke was earlier than Mark, Matthew, and John, because I think Luke did circulate with chapters 1 and 2. I don't think the whole thing that Marcion has, which is kind of a truncated version of our Luke, I don't think that all of that was the original Luke. I just think it originally didn't have chapters 1 and 2. My view is the view, I don't know, apart from Marcus, I don't know Klinghardt, I don't know Marcus Vincent. I don't know, I don't think most people are convinced at all that Marcion's version was the earlier version.
JC, thank you for your super chat. Are the crocus rosettas on the crosses at Rennes Chateau telling us something about the Mary Magdalene tradition? Did Saneri get the idea from the rosettas of Lady Carcass of Carcassonne?
I have to say I don't know much about it. I know that this is a deal in the Da Vinci Code, but I don't really know. I don't know enough to even comment on it. I will say that I've discussed at length other aspects of what is found in the Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown's novel, The Da Vinci Code. I wrote a book called Fact and Fiction in the Da Vinci Code. I don't deal with this particular thing, but I do deal with what it says about Mary Magdalene otherwise, to show how historically Dan Brown's portrayal of Mary Magdalene and the Emperor Constantine and the historical Jesus and the Council of Nicaea are just completely wrong, up and down the line, just provably wrong. But I don't deal with any of this particular material.
TELENIKON, thank you for your super chat. How is it possible to take the pseudo-Pauline letters seriously if they are acknowledged as forgeries? Shouldn't Christians be outraged to have forgeries in their scriptural canon?
So again, this is a very interesting and complicated question. I've written 2 books that deal with it. A book for a general audience is my book called Forged, with a subtitle, which I don't give these things their subtitles, but the titles. This thing was called Forged: Why the Authors of the Bible Are Not Who We Think They Are. So, okay, yeah, good. And it's not just the pseudo-Pauline epistles. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John weren't Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But there it is, Forged. Thank you. And I have a longer book, too. It's called Forgery and Counter-Forgery: The Use of Literary Deceit in the Early Christian Tradition. That one's for people who don't mind a little heavy-hitting scholarship. And so if you want the kind of version that is, not kind of going out of its way to sound scholarly, the Forged is perfectly fine. But if you really want the hard-hitting stuff, it's my Forgery and Counter-Forgery book. Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't claim to be written by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and so the authors they're not lying about it. Somebody later assigned them to somebody who didn't write them. It's not the writer's fault. The pseudo-Pauline letters and 1st and 2nd Peter and James and Jude, lots of other books in the New Testament actually claim to be written by certain authors who didn't write them. Today, we would call those things forgeries. And scholars tend to be reluctant to call them forgeries because forgery has such a negative connotation. And some scholars don't think it's appropriate for the ancient world And in my books, I try to explain why, in fact, the ancient terms are just as bad or even worse than forgery in terms of negative connotations, and that it's completely appropriate to talk about it for the ancient world because people in the ancient world talked about it and said nasty things about it. It was considered lying to write a book claiming to be an author you weren't. And in fact, one of the terms they use for books like this, they just call them pseudoi, which means lies. Most scholars don't like calling them forgeries, though, and they call them pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha literally means something like false writings, but it technically means writings that are entitled with a lie. So that's not much of a better term when you think about it. The pseudo-Pauline letters are the 6 letters that scholars think Paul did not write that claim to be written by Paul in the New Testament. There are other books outside the New Testament that also claim to be written by Paul that he did not write. For example, there's a 3rd Corinthians. There's a letter to the Laodiceans. There's an exchange of letters between Paul and the Roman philosopher Seneca, all of them forged. But so the ones in the New Testament are Ephesians, Colossians, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus, those 6. These all claim to be written by Paul, and scholars have very good reasons that I lay out in these books for why Paul probably didn't write them, or almost certainly didn't write them. And the question here is, how can you take them seriously if they're forgeries? And shouldn't Christians be outraged that they have forgeries in their canon? So these are 2 different questions with 2 very different answers. First of all, how do you take them seriously? Well, it depends what you mean by taking them seriously. And the question is, seriously for what? If you mean seriously for showing what Paul actually wrote, or for showing what Paul taught, or what Paul believed, or what he preached, or what he did, then you cannot probably use these books for understanding Paul's life and teachings. With that said, most scholars don't. Critical scholars, if they write a book on the views of Paul about Christ as Christology, or views of Paul about salvation, or whatever topic they want to talk about Paul, they almost always stick to the 7 undisputed letters, which, as I've said, are not really undisputed. Since everything's disputed in scholarship, there are people who say, yeah, Paul didn't really write this book, but not very many. Almost everybody agrees on the 7 undisputed. And so anybody who's writing a book about Paul, even if they think they might think, yeah, Paul probably did write Colossians, or they think, I think Paul did write 2nd Thessalonians. Even if that's their view, typically they stick to the 7 undisputed letters because they know that there are people who doubt whether Paul wrote the others. So if you're talking about how do you take them seriously for Pauline, understanding Paul, they're problematic for that. They can, though, be taken seriously for other things. I take them just as seriously as I take the undisputed letters, because because I'm interested in the undisputed letters for what they can tell me historically about what's happening in a particular time and place and among some people in early Christianity. Paul's letters are invaluable. The undisputed letters are invaluable. They tell us about Christian communities that otherwise we have no information about. And this is a first-hand account of these communities that Paul himself founded. And I take them very seriously to understand the theology of one of the major figures in the history of Christianity. I take the pseudo-Pauline letters seriously as well, but not for those reasons, but for other reasons. I'm interested in the pseudo-Pauline letters, just to take one example, the letter of Ephesians, which claims to be written by Paul, but seems to represent views, I do argue, does represent different views from Paul. What it shows is not what Paul really thought. It shows how a later community thought that it had the right interpretation of Paul and got it completely wrong. It shows us what happens in the history of Christianity after Paul's day among his own churches. One of the things that happens in Ephesians is many readers don't notice this. Scholars have noticed it for a long time. Paul, in the undisputed letters, especially in Galatians and Romans, insists that a person is made right with God apart from keeping the Jewish law. You're justified by faith in Christ, not by works of the law. He's emphatic about that, and that's his phrasing. Justified by faith, not by works of the law. In Ephesians, we find a very strong statement that a person is justified by faith and not by works. And it sounds just the same until you look closely at both what Paul's saying and what Ephesians is saying. Paul's talking about you are not justified by being Jewish, by doing the things that God commanded Jews to do in order to be Jews. In particular, Paul says if you're a Gentile man and you've come to be a believer in Jesus, you do not have to be circumcised. Paul's opponents said, well, of course you do. Paul's Christian opponents among Jewish followers of Jesus said, of course you do, because God gives circumcision to Abraham as an eternal covenant. All of the people of God will be circumcised. And so Abraham circumcised his non-Jewish slaves. You've got to circumcise anybody who's a follower of the God of Abraham. And Paul argued, no, you don't. So they went back and forth. The issue was, did you have to keep the rulings of the law in order to be a follower of Jesus? Paul says no. When you get to Ephesians, the author of Ephesians, who calls himself Paul, is not talking about that. It sounds like he's talking like Paul because he says you're justified by faith, not by works. But he doesn't mean works of the law. He doesn't mean circumcision and keeping kosher and observing the Sabbath and so forth. He means doing good deeds. You can't do enough good deeds to be saved. It sounds like Paul, but he's talking about something else. And it's not clear. He knows he's talking about something else. And so there's like lots of that kind of thing in Ephesians where he talks about something that Paul talks about, but he says something that's different, in some cases, really even more contradictory than that. And so it's interesting. The reason I take it seriously, because it tells us about what's happening in Pauline Christianity after Paul's day. As a historian, I take it with utmost seriousness. Now, the second question, though, is how can Christians, why aren't they outraged that they have forgeries in their scriptures? Two responses. One is conservative Christians who have a very high view of Scripture as the inspired Word of God typically don't think that there are forgeries in Scripture. They would say that the evidence that critical scholars mount to argue that Paul did not write Ephesians or Colossians or 2 Thessalonians or 1 Timothy, they'd say that evidence is not convincing. Paul really did write it. He wrote it. It's in the Bible. And so it's Pauline. And so that's, that would be one response. What about more liberal Christians who are interested in doing history as well as having faith, who don't believe in the inerrancy of the Bible? Aren't they outraged? They tend not to be. When I first encountered this, I went to Princeton Theological Seminary. I was an evangelical at the time. I did not believe there were any pseudepigrapha in the New Testament. I wouldn't bring myself to say the word forgery. But when I started thinking, I finally got to a point where I said, I just can't see how 1 Timothy could be written by Paul. And I got to that point when I studied and thought about it and just looked into it, looked at both sides of everything. I just don't believe he could have written this book, and I said, then I ended up saying the same thing about Titus. And I ended up saying, yeah, okay, I don't think any of these six actually goes back to Paul. I was still a Christian. And I wasn't outraged because as a Christian at the time, I was not a fundamentalist and I didn't have a fundamentalist view of the inerrancy of the Bible. I thought the Bible was a very human book through which God spoke. And I thought God could speak through a pseudonymous writing as well as any other kind of writing. Why not? Why not? My teacher, Bruce Metzger, had he was a prominent scholar and a very pious Christian who believed that 2 Peter was not written by Peter, even though it vehemently claims to be written by Peter, but he still considered it scripture. And when my teacher, Bruce Metzger, would talk about, like, he talked about the myth of creation in Genesis, the conservative students would get all over him. How can you call it a myth? It's in the inspired word of God. And Metzger, who's a very conservative Christian in lots of ways, just about every way, he'd say, well, who said God can't inspire a myth? So it's you that God inspired the forgeries. Okay, whatever. So you can have a range of explanations with it, and it's only if you're a fundamentalist that it causes huge problems. You have to say, yeah, there can't be any in there.
JC, thank you for your super chat. Could the White Stone of Revelation 2 be the Luque Stele?
I don't think the White Stone of Revelation 2 exists, so I don't. If that's what the question is, yeah.
Captain Dadpole, thank you for your super chat. I've noticed some scholars are starting to lean towards a later dating for the Gospels due to how little they are quoted. What are your thoughts?
I'm not, so this is purely anecdotal. In my experience, I'm not noticing that there's a lot of late dating going on, except somewhat with Luke and John. With Luke, I think it's because some scholars have become convinced over the last 20 years or so, maybe more, that the author of Luke, who also wrote the book of Acts, is dependent in Acts on the writings of Josephus. That some very, very fine scholars think that Luke had access to Josephus's writings, and including his Antiquities, which was written in the mid-90s, around 93 of the Common Era. And if Luke had access to a copy of Josephus' Antiquities, it had to be in circulation for a while, so it couldn't be before the early 2nd century probably. And people have started dating the book of Acts to the year 120. Now, if you think that, because the use of Josephus, if you think that Luke is written by the same person and that the Luke and Acts are written near the same time, as most people always thought, then you'd have to say, well, then Luke was written, sometime before around 120. A couple of provisos with that. You could say that Luke was written much earlier and Acts was written much later. You could say that a different author wrote Luke and Acts. You could say that you don't think that that the book of Acts shows evidence or compelling evidence of being written by somebody who knew Josephus. That's my line. I'm just not convinced that the book of Acts is dependent on Josephus, but some are. So that would be Luke. I suppose that's the reason. For John, I think, I don't know, people are starting to date a little bit later. Usually it's been dated around 90 to 95. People are starting to say around the year 100. And I'm not sure they have any good reason for that any more than people have that good of a reason to say 90. I mean, there's not much, really just not much to go on when it comes to dating one of these things. When you date a gospel, or when you date any writing from the ancient world that doesn't have a date on it, you take several steps. The first step you take is you figure out when it had to be written after. After what was it written? And have an obvious example. If you've got a biography of Jesus, if you've got a gospel of Jesus, it has to be written after the death of Jesus. Okay, good. So that gives you a start. Moreover, if you think it's written in Greek, which it is, then it has to be sometime after Christianity had spread to Greek areas where there were a lot of stories told about Jesus. Okay, how long does that take? So you just figure out, okay, when does it have to be written after at least? And when it comes to the Gospels, most scholars think that all 4 Gospels are written by people who know that the temple was destroyed in the year that the temple was destroyed, because they refer to it. There can be debates about whether they really knew about it or not, but it seems pretty convincing to most critical scholars that even Mark is being written right after the destruction of the temple, or at least like when it's imminent. And so Mark's usually dated to sometime after 70 when the temple was destroyed. So if you could show that Mark knew the destruction of the temple, if you could show that Matthew used Mark, then you could say Mark is after 70 and Matthew has to be after Mark. And so that gives you the after which thing. Then you try to find before when was it written. And for that, what you look for are places where somebody else quotes it. If you can show that somebody quotes the Gospel of John, then the Gospel of John had to be written before that person was writing. And so what you do is you set parameters where you get it couldn't have been written before this, and it couldn't have been written after that. And sometimes that evidence is secure. Sometimes the evidence is relatively secure. Sometimes it's quite iffy, and you argue about it. But then you come to a conclusion. Look, Justin Martyr, he is quoting Matthew and Luke. He may not name them Matthew and Luke, but these quotations are definitely Matthew. Okay, so you say, right, so it's got to be 150. And for all four Gospels, Irenaeus in 185 quotes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and calls them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, so let's just say it's got to be between 70 and 185, and then Justin appears to be quoting the Matthew and Luke, so they're so they're 150. So it's sometime between 75 and 150. Okay, so where within that period do you think? And that's when you have to, it gets a little trickier, because you have quotations of Jesus already in the Didache, which is written around the year 100, that sound like they come from Matthew and Luke. You have a passage in Ignatius writing around the year 110 or 112, which seems to show that he knows about the story of the wise men following a star, which is in Matthew, and so forth. So you have to debate. Is he getting this from Matthew? Getting it from somewhere else? What's the evidence, this way or the other? But you do it like that. When you do it like that, most people are pretty convinced that these books are written still at the end of the first century, after the destruction of the temple, but before you start getting authors like Ignatius and Polycarp and such. And so they're kind of guesstimates, but they're guesstimates that do have clear boundaries.
Let's get to the next super chat. Phil Rocker, thank you for your super chat. Love your work. What are your thoughts on Richard C. Miller's work, including Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity?
Well, I'll tell you, I remember reading that, but I don't remember what I concluded about it. Sorry. When I read that book, it was when it just came out, and I actually took notes on it. And I'm sorry, if you had asked me this and hadn't given me a chance to look it up, I would have had something to say. I'm sorry. I remember thinking that it was an impressive book in some ways, but I don't remember either being overwhelmed by it or being underwhelmed by it. And so that's usually how I am by books, I guess. Sorry. I'm sorry that, I'm sorry.
No problem at all. J West 14, thank you for your super chat. Was Matthew's nativity story a later addition?
So I mentioned earlier that I think that Luke 1 and 2 was added later to Luke's gospel. Some people, I didn't come up with that. That's been a view that's been around for a while, and I think there's good evidence for it. It's debated. I doubt if it's the majority view, but it's a view that some people have. I'm one of them. Matthew, there are a few people who argue that Matthew chapters 1 and 2 are also an addition to Matthew, that it originally did not have the birth narrative. And I disagree with that one. I think Matthew really did have chapters 1 and 2. The evidence is completely different in the two cases. I discussed this one, by the way, in a course on the course of Matthew that I just did. I did an 8-lecture course on Matthew that you can find at my website, bartehrman.com, where I talk about textual changes to Matthew in one of my lectures. And I include the question, was Matthew 1 and 2 originally there or not? And I think I really think it was, because unlike Luke, the material in Matthew 1 and 2 coincides very closely with what you get in the rest of Matthew. You get the views of Jesus are the same. The idea that Jesus came to fulfill Scripture, that there are explicit prophecies of Scripture that Jesus literally fulfilled, you find that abundantly in the first 2 chapters, and you find it throughout the rest in other places in the gospel. The importance of Jesus' Jewishness is stressed quite strongly in the beginning and throughout Matthew's gospel, et cetera, et cetera. It coincides so well. And in particular, in this course I did, I gave a lecture where one lecture part of the lecture was showing how the story of the wise men visiting Jesus it's a really problematic story historically. I mean, it's like, man, there are all sorts of problems trying to figure that one, how that could have happened. I don't think it could have happened the way it's described. But what I do in this talk is I try to show how that one story, it's 12 verses long, encapsulates virtually the entire Gospel of Matthew. It presents Matthew's views of Jesus in a nutshell and in ways people wouldn't expect. And so I kind of try to uncover that gem, and it's in the first 2 chapters of Matthew. So I think the rest of Matthew's gospel is intricately interwoven in chapters 1 and 2. And so I think it was originally part of it.
Musings from an Old Mancy. Thank you for your super chat. Hello, I'm Mr. Q. A source is a source, of course, and no one can dig up the saying source, but is, of course, unless the source is the famous Mr. Q.
This person is dating himself or herself, or else watches a lot of reruns. Mr. Ed, are you kidding me? Okay, call me Mr. Ed. Right. So Q has become a debated issue these days. Again, back when I was studying this stuff seriously for the first time in graduate school, Q was a non-problematic proposition. As I think I said earlier, you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and that it's usually conceded that Matthew and Luke used Mark as one of their sources. But they have materials, especially sayings material, that they have in common, sometimes verbatim, word for word the same, that cannot be found in Mark. And you can't get verbatim agreements between sources unless somebody's copying somebody or they're both copying something else. Q, by definition, is the source that provided Matthew and Luke with their materials that are not found in Mark, that they share. Matthew and Luke share a lot of materials, almost all sayings, not completely, but almost all sayings that are not in Mark. They didn't get them from Mark because Mark doesn't have them. And there are reasons for thinking that Luke did not copy Matthew and that Matthew did not copy Luke. If that's the case, then they must have gotten them from some other source. Scholars who came up with this view were working in Germany in the 19th century, and they called this the sayings source because it provided the sayings that was the source for many of the sayings of Matthew and Luke. Source, so if it's the sayings source in German is Quelle. That's the word for source. It's spelled Quelle. And so scholars started just calling this thing Q for short. It refers to the hypothetical document used by Matthew and Luke for their material not found in Mark. When I was in graduate school, everybody basically took Q for granted because there really are good reasons for thinking that Matthew didn't copy Luke and that Luke didn't copy Matthew. And so Q was fairly non-problematic, even though everybody knew we didn't have it, but it was a hypothetical source with good evidence behind it. What happened as a result of people saying it was non-problematic is people started writing these really speculative books about Q and saying all sorts of things about Q. Some things that just about everybody seemed to assume is true. Like the common line was Q did not have a passion narrative. The reason for thinking that is because Matthew and Luke don't have any traditions, any stories, any sayings in their passion narratives that they agree on that are not found in Mark. So there wasn't any, so it doesn't come from Q. Therefore, Q didn't have a passion narrative. That's a flawed piece of logic. It's just amazing to me that people got away with that one for so long. The fact that Matthew and Luke don't have shared materials in the passion narrative that are not found in Mark does not prove that Q did not have a passion narrative. It just means that if it did, that both Matthew and Luke didn't quote it. So I always drawn a firm distinction between what you can say was in Q and what you cannot say was not in Q. You can't say what was not in Q, because if the whole idea is if you got the source and that Matthew copies some of it, Luke copies some of it, and so they share these things. Well, there may be places where Q had something that that Matthew copied that Luke didn't copy. Or there could be places in Q that Luke copied and Matthew didn't copy. In which case, you'd have something only in Luke or only in Matthew that came from Q. That could have happened in the Passion narrative. And there could have been places in Q that neither Matthew nor Luke copied. The agreements of Matthew and Luke in Material Against Mark tells you what's in Q, but it doesn't tell you what's not in Q. So that was one kind of big problem that almost everybody had. And people started writing books about the theology of Q, by which they meant the theology of a collection of Jesus sayings, a list of Jesus sayings without a passion narrative. What kind of theology would somebody like that have? Well, it sounds kind of like the Gospel of Thomas. And so maybe it had a kind of theology of Jesus sayings like the Gospel of Thomas. So you have a book on that. Or the community of Q. What was the community like that was behind the Q source? You don't even have the Q source. You write a book about the community behind it. And so all of that started happening in especially in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, into the 80s. Now, I said that it's a disputed topic. The reason it's disputed is because there are scholars now who are saying that Q probably did not exist. There have always been scholars who said that, but the vast majority of scholars have found the evidence for Q compelling, and most of us still do. It's not a perfect solution to the synoptic problem, to the problem of why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar in so many ways and yet have differences. Q is still considered by most people the best solution, but there's another view that's out there that has been around for a very long time that now is being brought back to life. So the main person propounding this is Mark Goodacre, who is my friend and who teaches at crosstown rival Duke. And we've known each other for years and years, decades. But he doesn't think there's a Q, and he agrees with the view that his teacher maintained, Michael Goulder, which was the view that his teacher maintained, who's a guy named Farrer, and it's called the Farrer hypothesis, which is that Matthew used Mark and Luke used Matthew and Mark. That explains why sometimes Luke agrees with Matthew and Mark, sometimes agrees with Matthew but not Mark, sometimes agrees with Mark and not Matthew. So it's because Luke used them both. That is, I think everybody can admit, that's a simpler solution to how the three relate to each other, because you don't have to hypothesize a non-existent source. So to that extent, it's a simpler solution. But in the opinion of most of us, it creates more problems than it solves, which get down into kind of technical things. But for example, why it is, if Luke used Matthew and he used Mark, why is it whenever there's material that he gets from Matthew that is not found in Mark, he puts it in a different location? But the material that's in Matthew that is in Mark, he puts in the same location as Matthew. Why do his agreements in sequencing happen to be in material not found that's in Matthew that's not found in Mark? How is he doing this exactly? Was he taking every 3 words and seeing if it's in Mark once he finds it in Matthew? How does he do this exactly? Let's read through all of Mark. How does that work? And so there are problems with this, and it's down in the weeds, and people go way further down in the weeds. But Mark Goodacre has been propounding this, and his students, his graduate students, his PhD students, and other people are being convinced by it. And so it's a bona fide option to the idea that there was a Q, which I think probably what our muser, who is Mr. Q, was wondering about.
Mr. Warlight, thank you for your super chat. What do you make of the historical parallel that the main companion of Apollonius of Tyana is Damas, and Paul states in 2 Timothy that Demas departed him because he chose the world over Christianity?
It's a good question. I don't have an answer for it. I mean, it looks to me like an accidental agreement. There are probably more differences between Damas and Demas than there are similarities. We don't have much information about Demas from 2 Timothy. I think that I don't know the answer. Apollonius of Tyana would have been thriving in the period right before Second Timothy was written, so it's possible that people had heard stories about him. I don't know if Damas was as well known at the time, but he is attributed to being the main companion of Apollonius, and so it is an interesting coincidence. But unless there's some kind of compelling reason to think that one knew about the other, it doesn't really get us very far. I think there is no way to think that the author of Second Timothy was familiar with the stories of Apollonius of Tyana, and I don't think there's any way that that the author who tells about Apollonius tells us about Apollonius of Tyana would have known Second Timothy. So unless you have some reason, somebody has some reason for kind of an argument for how they could have known about each other or whatever, then I would just talk up to just an interesting coincidence. But I have no horse in the race, and would be happy to be convinced otherwise.
James Valiant, thank you for your super chat. Professor Ehrman is always great. Thank you both.
Okay, thank you.
Levintinian, thank you for your super chat. Who wrote the Evangelion? Was it written before or after Luke? What is its relationship, if any, with Q? You want to give a brief answer to that, since we kind of touched on it.
Well, I don't know if this means if this person's referring to Marcion's Evangelion. The word so I probably need to say a little bit more about it. The word Evangelion simply means gospel, and so that could refer to any gospel. Yeah, it does look like this person's referring to Marcion's Evangelion. I think that it is an edited version of Luke, and that I think that Marcion, I do think that Marcion had some form of Luke available to him. One interesting question in relation to it is, why did he call it the Evangelion? He calls so he's got this canon of scripture where he's got, well, I didn't quite get into it. I said that he's got the 10 letters of Paul, and he has a form of Luke. I guess I did say that. Those are the 11 books that he has, but he doesn't call them Luke, and he calls the Luke portion the Evangelion, and the Paul portion the apostolos, the apostle. So it's the gospel and the apostle are the two parts of his canon. And I think that these are, I don't think that either part was written before Luke or Paul. But one interesting question is, did the form of Luke that he had available to him, was it identified as Luke already? I think the answer is no. He's getting this, probably becoming acquainted with it when he's a young man, maybe in the 120s or so. I don't think Luke was named yet. And so why wouldn't he call it the Evangelion? I don't think he knew that it had a name attached to it. But the other question is, why does he, what was the other question? Hold on a second. There's another question about this that is really, I've been answering so many questions now, I've gotten mixed up in my head what the other question was about the oh yeah, this is the other question. Why does he use that one? Why doesn't he use Matthew? Or why doesn't he use John or Mark? Why does he use this one, Luke? And people have debated that one. The answer somebody might make is that since his hero is Paul, the Evangelion is the one that written by Luke, the companion of Paul. But it doesn't look like it was called Luke, and there's nothing to indicate that anybody thought it was written by the companion of Paul at the time. My view of this is that this happens to be the gospel that was in his hometown when he was growing up. It's one he grew up with in church, and so that's the one he used.
Sword of Plowshares, thank you for your super chat. If chapters 1 and 2 of Luke are later additions, including Luke 1 to 1:4, then what evidence do we have the original author of Luke also wrote Acts?
Great question. And I didn't get into this part of it because I thought I was already going too long and too deep. I don't think Luke 1, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4 were, I don't think that they were missing from the original Luke. In other words, what I think happened when I said chapters 1 and 2 weren't there, I mean starting with verse 5. So, for those who don't know what we're talking about here, Luke 1, verses 1 through 4 are the verses where the author, he begins by saying, many have undertaken to write an account of the things that have been accomplished among us, oh dear Theophilus, but I've followed these things closely, and now I'm going to write you an accurate account. Okay, that's basically what he says in these 4 verses. And then he launches into the story of the birth of John the Baptist. My view is that Luke's gospel did not have the birth narratives of chapters 1 and 2, but it did. This is the original beginning of Luke, that he said that, and then then the next verse, which would have been chapter 1, verse 5, I guess, the next verse is what is now chapter 3, verse 1, when he dates the appearance of John the Baptist. So he states the first 4 verses, and then he goes right into the John the Baptist narrative, just as his source Mark did, but done differently. But he begins with John the Baptist. So I'm sorry, swords of plowshares. I should have said that earlier, that I think that the prologue of Luke was originally the prologue of Luke, and as you've noted, it's very similar to the prologue of Acts, where again, the same author says, now that I've said everything that Jesus said and did, let me continue, oh dear Theophilus, So, and so it's pretty clear he's claiming to be the same person. So I think it was originally part of the gospel.
Karen Richardson, thank you for your super sticker. Appreciate it. J West 14, thank you for your super chat. Could Cassius Dio's story of King Tiridates and Magi's travel to Rome be the origin for Matthew's nativity story, or vice versa?
Yeah, people wondered about that and have suggested it. And what do we know? So Cassius Dio, of course, is writing long after Matthew. Probably a little bit over a century after Matthew, but he's repeating some kind of tradition. My sense is that they're both using a kind of trope that is floating around about wise men from the East who travel either to bring their wisdom or to acquire more wisdom, and so these are exotic tales of exotic people who are astronomers or who are philosophers who travel and make some kind of impact on the place that they arrive at. And I think that's probably a trope of some kind. In other words, kind of a formal story that's floating around. And I suspect that both the Cassius Dio and the Matthew stories are just participating in that trope, that they're not like related or dependent on each other.
TELENIKON, thank you for your super chat. Each successive gospel in the New Testament canon seem like modern movie remakes. Was it this kind of creative license why John's gospel chose to switch events around, such as Jesus' upsetting the temple?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And what I would say is that both Matthew and Luke are remakes of Mark, because they clearly had Mark as a source, and they're trying to, they expand Mark. They, especially Luke, takes things out of Mark's narrative. Matthew does a little bit. Luke does a little bit more. They repeat most of Mark. Most of Mark is in Matthew, and less is in Luke, but still, most of Mark's still in Luke. And so they're doing remakes, Hollywood remakes in the sense, and the remakes are significant. They're not just kind of like doing the same story again. Both Matthew and Luke end up retelling the story in ways that are significant, so that if you really want to understand what Matthew's talking about, you have to understand how it's different from the source that he used. That's how I developed my understanding of Matthew in this course that I did recently. Luke is the same thing. He has remade Mark in significant ways, so that if you want to understand Luke's Jesus, you've got to understand how he's changed his source, because it's like a Hollywood remake where you got the original and then you change it around. The question is whether John is like that. And the issue is another issue that has become debated that used to not be debated. Or rather, I should say, it's always been debated since the Enlightenment, but the pendulum keeps swinging. So 30 years ago, this wasn't much of a debate. Now it's a debate. Whether John knew Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Many of us were trained to think, no, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are sufficiently different from John that it doesn't look like John actually used them. And I still insist that's true, certainly in a strict sense. John certainly didn't use Matthew, Mark, and Luke the way that Matthew used Matthew used Mark, because Matthew actually is copying words, word for word. I mean, you can show, I think you could show that Matthew used Mark, verbatim agreements. The question is, how high is your standard of proof? When it comes to who copied whom in the ancient world, I have a fairly high standard, very high. I think the person who thinks that one author copied another bears the burden of proof and has to have some pretty good evidence. And if you have word for word agreements, that's good evidence. Is the fact they tell similar stories? Could be. If they're like weird stories you wouldn't expect two people independently to tell. Or if they tell them the same sequence, possibly. Depends on the sequence. If you got a sequence of story where somebody's baptized and then they have a ministry, then they go to Jerusalem and then they get killed, then they get raised from the dead. I mean, that sequence is just kind of the sequence people told about the stories of Jesus. So like those, if you have that sequence, it doesn't mean you're getting it from, Matthew or you got it from Luke. It's just like, this is the form that people are telling the stories. So I think you've got to have some pretty good evidence. And there are very fine scholars. Some of the finest scholars of John right now are saying, yes, they think that John used Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If so, it is more than a remake. It is like, man, it's a new movie with by somebody who knew the earlier movies. Maybe it's about the same character, but it is a different movie. But it is an interesting analogy because it's a similar phenomenon in a sense that you've seen or heard one version, and now you're going to talk about the same topic in a sense, but do a different version of it.
John Petkos, thank you for your super chat. Appreciate it. Can you tell us a bit about the distorted memories and the death of Jesus?
Right. Okay. We're back to my book, Jesus Before the Gospels. Let me say, I think this is one book that I allowed the wrong title to go on because people don't realize what this book is about. And I was just writing somebody today, and I said, I think this is the best book I've ever read I've ever written that nobody's read. It's not as widely read as some of my other books, even though I think it's in some ways it's really one of my more important books because it tries to deal with this issue of memory and how people in the ancient world remembered Jesus. And I have to explain, you can remember something that you didn't experience yourself. If somebody tells you a story, like one of your siblings tells you a story about one of your parents, and it's not something you saw, but you hear from your sibling. You remember hearing the story, and in that sense, you remember what your parent did. So memory isn't just something that happened to you. It's not just something you memorize. Memory is a complicated thing, and in my book, I'll tell you, this was a fun book to write because I spent 2 years doing almost nothing in my research except reading psychological studies of memory, like things by people who had nothing to do with the New Testament, nothing about Jesus, nothing about religion, just how do we know how memory works? And how do we know how stories get passed along in oral cultures? Cultures who don't have writing, we always heard that they remember things perfectly because they have to. They can't check the writing. So they train themselves, so they memorize everything and they pass them along accurately and they don't make mistakes and they take measures to make sure they don't make mistakes. And we all heard that. And so I decided to look into it and actually not to read what New Testament people say, who haven't read any research about it, but just repeating what they heard some other New Testament person say. I decided to read anthropological studies about oral cultures because there's a lot of anthropological studies of oral cultures. And I was just reading all this had nothing to do with the New Testament. And oh man, this was so enlightening. But one of the things that I was very interested in was this issue of distorted memories or false memories. which is a very big topic among psychologists, especially, but also among anthropologists and sociologists who are studying group memories, how memories get changed. And just on the psychological level, it is scary when you start reading this stuff in some ways, this literature, because psychologists have ways of proving things about what you remember and don't remember. Like, for example, the day after you hear about 9/11, for those of you old enough to have experienced 9/11, as I did, all of us, every one of us who heard about it, remember where we were, who we were with, how we heard it, etc. Okay, fair enough. So some psychologists, a couple of psychologists and teaching in a university somewhere in America, had, after the event, had their students write down where they were, who they were with, how they heard it, that kind of thing. And then a couple years later, had them go back and look at their answers, and their memories were completely different. Oh no, that's not how it happened. It happened like this. And so they have ways, psychologists have ways of showing whether you remember things well or not. And the studies are so interesting and so creative, sometimes fantastic. So I learned all that stuff in order to write about what can we say about how the memories of Jesus. People were repeating stories about Jesus in oral cultures. So how do oral cultures transfer their knowledge? How do they transmit their information? And how do people remember? How do people remember what they experienced? How do people remember what they heard, what they read? Do people have distorted memories? Here's a scary fact. We cannot tell the difference between a false memory and a true memory in our head. They both seem exactly alike. You can't evaluate a memory and say, oh yeah, that one really happened. Oh, no, there's no difference in how you experience them in your head, which means you're just as convinced by your false memories as by your true memories. So there's like study after study after study that proves this. So anyway, so my question, once I had that stuff under my belt, I wanted to know about the teachings of Jesus, the deeds of Jesus, the death of Jesus. And so what kind of distorted memories do we have about the death of Jesus? Well, I mean, I have a whole section in my book, maybe even a chapter in my book about this. I mean, I'll give you one thing. I mean, the thing that precipitated Jesus' death, according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is that he went into the temple, and he comes to Jerusalem for a Passover feast. He goes into the temple, and he overturns all these tables of people exchanging money and people selling animals, and he drives them all out of the temple. And according to Mark, he didn't allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. Okay, that's our first account, and it's obviously a little bit longer than that. But the point of this is this bit about he didn't allow anybody to carry anything through the temple. How's that work exactly? In the sacrificial cult that's going on in the temple, there's sacrifices going on. You can't have sacrifices if people can't carry knives and bowls filled with blood and carcasses and skins. And but Jesus stopped the whole proceeding. Jesus stopped the temple cult in Jerusalem? Like he brought it to first of all, how does that happen? The temple was, the walls around the temple could enclose 25 American football fields. Big. How does one man stop that? And how could Jesus have done that and the temple authorities not arrest him on the spot? And so, like, you can go through these things and like, man, it just looks like an exaggeration. Somebody's not remembering this thing right. Or, like the choice of Barabbas over Jesus, where Pontius Pilate gives the people, it's done differently in different gospels. And so part of the problem is you get different stories that don't agree with each other. But apart from that, just the basic concept, Pontius Pilate decides to release a prisoner to the Jewish crowds on the Passover to appease them, because it's their great holy day. And he offers up to them either Jesus, whom he hopes they take, or this guy Barabbas, who is an insurrectionist who's in jail for murder. And the Jewish people want the murderer rather than the Son of God. This is an anti-Jewish story. Of course, the story is bad-mouthing Jews for wanting the wrong kind of person. They want somebody who's going to sponsor a violent rebellion against Rome. That's who they prefer to somebody who's willing to lay down his life for them. So those Jews, so that's anti-Jewish stuff. But can this be historical? There's no record of any governor anywhere in the Roman world giving over a prisoner for crimes against the state to a crowd. Certainly no record of Pilate doing it. It's completely against everything we know about Pilate from every source that survives that says anything about him. Moreover, this is a person who's in jail for insurrection. In other words, he's not just like a petty thief or something. He has participated in a rebellion against Rome, and he's in prison for murder. That must mean that he's killed a Roman soldier. And Pilate volunteers to release him to be a nice guy? Oh my God. So in my book, I go into some length, but man, that just cannot be right. And then the question is, well, then if it's not right historically, what's it all about? Well, it's about the Jews preferring the wrong guy. And it's not only that, but there's no history of somebody named this person Barabbas, but the name Barabbas in Aramaic means son of the Father. Which son of God do you want? Do you want the son of the Father who's an insurrectionist who wants to attack the Romans? Or do you want one who's willing to die for the sins of the world? Well, the Jewish people choose the wrong one. And so it's a very symbolic story, but it's not an accurate memory. So I would call that a distorted memory.
And can you tell us a little bit about the memory of Q and the memory of Paul?
Well, it's a little harder to talk about the memory of Q
Regarding
because we don't know who. Regarding Jesus, yeah. Okay, I got it. Yeah. So how's Jesus remembered in Q and how's Jesus remembered in Paul? We have to make some assumptions about Q to answer that question. So let's just assume, like if the way you want to assume, which I don't really assume, but suppose you want to assume that the material found in Matthew and Mark, Matthew and Luke, not found in Mark, is all that was in Q, then you'd have a group of sayings of Jesus that are really more focused on how we ought to live our lives in the here and now, giving good ethical advice about how to treat one another and how to behave in relationship to God. And it would be a focus on the teachings of Jesus as being what really matters about him. That's not what really matters to Paul in his surviving writings. He doesn't think the teachings of Jesus are all that important, apparently, because he only quotes two of them explicitly, and well, three of them actually. I said two earlier, it's three. All of them in 1 Corinthians, one in chapter 7, chapter 9, chapter 11. He quotes three of them. For Paul, the sayings of Jesus are not really what matter about him. What matter about him are his death and resurrection. That Jesus died for sins and he was raised from the dead, and that those who believe in his death and resurrection will have salvation. Q appears to be closer to the kinds of things that Jesus himself might have said, which is that you need to return to God and you need to obey God. These are the ways you can obey God, and if you do, you will enter into the coming kingdom. Q definitely believes there's a coming kingdom and that you need to be prepared for it, but you get into the kingdom by following Jesus' ethical teachings. Whereas for Paul, it's the death and resurrection of Jesus that really matter. So they're different memories of Jesus in that sense. You're muted, Jacob. Jacob, you're muted. There you go.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was just saying. I'm gonna take these two super chats and then I'll ask my closing question.
Okay.
Justin, thank you for your super chat. What is your view on John 10:34? You are gods. Jesus implying we are all gods that follow his teachings.
Yeah, I've been thinking lately if I could come up with a several instances where Jesus makes an argument just to befuddle his interlocutors. So this is one of those where Jesus says something, and it seems to be he's saying it just to shut up his opponents. He has several things like that, like in the Synoptic Gospels, where he asks the scribes and Pharisees if they think David is the the Messiah is the son of David, and they said, yes, sure. And he says, well, then why is it that in the Psalms David calls him his Lord? The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. Why would David call him his Lord if he's his son? And the scribes and Pharisees just, they have no answer to this. Like, oh my God, I don't know. How could it be? I don't know. And like he shuts them up by asking them a question they can't answer, which is great. I mean, because like Socrates did that kind of thing all the time, just asked stuff people couldn't answer. And I think there are places in the New Testament where Jesus does that. He just says something that people can't answer, but he doesn't have the answer either. And this is kind of like that for me. It's in this passage where they're offended that they say, look, you're calling yourself God. He just said, I and the Father are one in verse 30. And they take up stones to stone him. He said, why are you trying to stone me? I'm just, because you call yourself God. Well, scripture itself says you are gods. Oh, yeah, I guess it does, doesn't it? So like he's just like shutting them up, basically. Could he meant something further by it? It depends how sophisticated we take him to be in the passage. Throughout some parts of both Jewish and Christian tradition, it was understood that humans have a divine spark within them, and that humans, in a sense, are gods, just as angels in the Bible are called gods, and humans are sometimes called superior to angels, so they're gods. And so it doesn't mean they're like God in the sense of the creator of the heaven and earth, but it means that they are, in some sense, divine heavenly beings. And Jesus certainly in the Gospel of John thinks that he's come down from heaven in order to take people up to heaven, and that they will go up to heaven if they experience a new birth and are born of heaven. And in the ancient world, if you're taken up to heaven, you are an immortal. And if you are an immortal, that's a synonym for God in the ancient world, in Greek tradition. A synonym for God is the immortals, going back to Homer. And so if you're made immortal, you're made into a god, and that's what John's understanding of Jesus is that you're going to be made into a divine immortal being. And so to that extent, maybe he is referring to that in John 10:34.
Mr. Warlight, thank you for your super chat. Based on the literacy rate throughout the Roman Empire, could the average Roman read, or did converts rely on the bishop's 70 disciples preaching alone? And if so, why did they use the manuscripts?
Okay, good question. The first thing to say is that literacy rates were very low in the Roman Empire by modern standards. The idea of massive literacy, where the society is concerned that their young learn how to read and write and do arithmetic, that is a very modern thing that started with the Industrial Revolution. And so prior to the whenever you date the kind of the massive literacy, kind of mid-19th century, it wasn't understood that that everybody would go to school. There have been detailed studies of literacy in the Roman world. The classic study that I still like very much is by William Harris, called Ancient Literacy. Harris argues that in the best of times in Greek and Roman antiquity, 10 to 15% of the population could read. That 10 to 15% is almost exclusively people living in urban areas, major urban areas, and they're people who are not among the poor, but they're among the elite who have the resources, families that have the resources to enable one or more of their children to attend school instead of working. Most people had to put their kids to work early on just to keep food on the table. So the best of times means like in Athens during the classical period. In the Roman world, maybe 10% of the population could read. Fewer than that could write, and fewer of those who could write could compose, and fewer than those who could compose could actually write a book. So not very many people were capable of writing books by percentages. So people who converted to Christianity, could they read? Most, no, they could not. They could not read. One interesting question is, since Christianity, unlike other religions, became a religion of the book, where the writings became all important, why didn't bishops teach their people to read? The bishops would have been educated. Bishops were chosen because they were of higher status within society as a rule, and they've got to know the scriptures, and they've got to be more elite people with some education as a rule. Why didn't they set up reading programs so that people could read the scriptures? It's a good question. I had a student named Kim Haynes Eitzen who wrote her master's thesis on this question, and she tried to show that, in fact, it was kind of a power question. If you got people who are relying on you to convey the truth, and the truth is in written documents, and you're the only one who can read the documents, read them out loud, emphasizing certain things as you read, and interpreting what you just read, then you got control over your community. Interesting idea. By the way, this wasn't just kind of a crazy idea by a low-level scholar. She went on and did her PhD and published her PhD dissertation and became the chair of the department at Cornell University. So this is a serious scholar. So anyway, so that's an interesting question. But this question this person's asking is, did they rely on what others said, their leaders? And if so, why did they use manuscripts? So the deal is that most people in the ancient world read books by hearing them read. Just like today, people today, advanced 2,000 years. Oh yeah, I read War and Peace. Really? Well, I did it on Audible. So like in my car. So like you hear it on Audible and you say you read it. Well, in the ancient world, that's how most people read. So in a Christian community, the person who could read was usually the leader, and he, almost always a he, would stand up and read a book and a manuscript, a handwritten copy of one of Paul's letters or a gospel. It becomes a point where within the church, this is the point where mainly it's males who are in the clergy. There's a lower level of clergy that are called readers. And so, you get bishops, and you get priests, and you get bishops, you get deacons and stuff, and you get readers. And so they're using the manuscripts. Not people usually didn't privately own manuscripts. They were church property. Usually they were expensive to have. But then you'd have a reader reading the manuscripts. And the manuscripts were very, very important, even though most people couldn't read. Within Christianity, most people never could read until the Industrial Revolution.
And so my closing question, and then we actually have 2 more super chats again, so I'll take those in real quick. Where is Josephus getting his information from regarding Jesus and James?
We don't know. I mean, I assume, he has a short paragraph on Jesus that parts of it almost certainly don't go back to Josephus in this paragraph. He says some things that he absolutely could have known, that Jesus was a teacher, that he had many followers, that he was reputed to do astounding things, that the enemies of his people, the Jewish people, turned on him, turned him over to the Roman governor Pilate, who had him crucified. All of that could easily simply have been common knowledge about this person. Josephus did research for his work, but a lot of his research would have been interviews with people, and it wasn't like hidden in a closet that there was this man Jesus. He wasn't particularly important, and Josephus doesn't say anything particularly important about him. He talks a lot more about lots and lots of other people. He has longer stories about other people named Jesus, but he does have that paragraph. And then in the later section, in book 20 of his Antiquities, he has a short line about the death of James, who's stoned to death somewhat illegally by the Jewish authorities in Israel when the high priest wasn't around, or when the governor wasn't around. And he says that James is the brother of the one Jesus who's called the Messiah. So where does he get this information from? I mean, he got it from where he gets his other information, mainly from oral traditions, probably. When I said that paragraph, most of it probably goes back to Josephus, in my judgment. I think that's the common judgment, although there are dissenters. But there are passages in that thing, like certain things that he says that could not have gone back to Josephus, where he says Jesus was the Messiah, and that he was raised from the dead on the 3rd day, as the scriptures say, that kind of thing. Yeah, he didn't say those things, but probably this was a text that was copied by a Christian scribe, and he inserted a couple things to make sure his reader realized who he's talking about.
All right, let's take these two final super chats real quick. Aaron Smith, thank you for your super chat. Bart, I'm a huge fan. If you had to guess, who do you think came up with these stories in the Gospel of Mark? Flavian, Piso, Josephus?
No, there's no way any of that. I know there's a book or two out there claiming this. There's no way that this was written by a non-follower of Jesus who was a Roman authority of some kind. The people who've written those books they frankly really just don't know what they're talking about. It may sound like they do, and I'm just telling you, they don't understand Roman history. They don't understand the history of early Judaism. They don't understand the New Testament. They don't understand the history of early Christianity. They're just making stuff up. And it's so much so that nobody even, scholars, my scholars in the classics department who are experts on like Roman history and stuff would not, they don't take it seriously because it's so easy to take apart. So who wrote it? A Christian wrote it. A Christian who is a follower of Jesus. He got his stories from the oral traditions, which is what I talk about in my book, Jesus Before the Gospels, traditions that had been in circulation around the empire for decades. We don't know where this person was living or what his name was. He almost certainly is living in an urban area. He's almost certainly highly educated as a Greek-speaking person. I think he was not Jewish because he explains things to his audience about the Jews that shows they weren't Jewish because he has to explain these things. And that probably show that he wasn't Jewish because he explains them incorrectly for Jews. And so he doesn't understand Judaism very well. So I don't have a name. There are 60 million people living in the empire. Most of them couldn't write, but we have very, very few pieces of information about who did write. But anyway, it was some Christian who heard these stories in a big urban area that spoke Greek.
And the last one, John Pitcos, thank you for your super chat. In Mark and Matthew, Jesus sheds his blood for the sake of many, but in Luke, he does so for his disciples, likewise in Paul. What do you make of this?
I'm not sure what John, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, that it's just for the disciples. Do you mean just, I don't know what you mean by that, because Jesus' death is for everybody in all four Gospels and in Paul, but all four Gospels and Paul agree that not everybody accept his death for salvation. So I think maybe John, since you're not here for me to interview, I think maybe you're referring to the Last Supper, the words in the Last Supper. Because Paul and Luke have a similar version of what Jesus said at the Last Supper, and Matthew and Mark have a similar view of what was said. And they're two different views. Oh, they're close, but they're different. And I think you're saying, why was that changed between Paul and Luke on one hand and Mark and Matthew on the other? I don't know what the answer is. But I probably should maybe just let me look at the text here very quickly, because
Sure.
I'm not sure that that's part of it that gets changed. A second, just let me look and see. Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Actually, Mark also doesn't say for everyone. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. In Mark. Oh, wait, and then I'm sorry, I've got something on my screen that's interrupting one. He does for. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think Mark, Paul, and Luke, they have it that it dies. Oh, is it that he dies for you? Maybe he's talking for you, and he thinks that's referring to. I don't know. Are you still with me, Jacob?
Yes, I am.
Okay,
He posted this about a minute ago. He said yes, so I think you were on the right track.
Okay.
Regarding the question earlier, but
yeah.
anyway.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
No problem.
Can you hold on a second? I've got something mixed up here with my audio and video.
Okay.
Okay. Well, if you can you still see and hear me, Jacob?
Yes, I can.
Okay. because there. Okay, now I'm back with you. Sorry.
Well, we're closing anyway, so it's no problem.
Yes. Okay.
I want to thank everybody for their super chats. Thank everybody for watching the episode, and I will see everybody later. Thank you for joining me today, Bart Ehrman.
Thank you for having me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.